All right, here we are again, beautiful people. We're going to do some metacognition on your last exam today, but I have a little bit of a throwback and inspiration for you. Here it goes.
Do it! Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday, you said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true! Just do it! Some people dream of success while you're gonna wake up and work hard at it. Nothing is impossible. Anyone else would quit, and you're not gonna stop there. No, what are you waiting for? Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can! Just do it! You're tired of starting over. Stop giving up.
So inspiring. I hope that motivated you for a little metacog right now. So we're going to look over some of the most missed questions of the Period 7 exam. So these are the results as I see them. So you can see kind of which questions were the most. So we're going to go through 5, 8, 23, 14, 19, 21, 29, and 1. I think 2 as well, because there was such a divide on the answers there. This is what tells me, or this is my view of what tells me which answers you guys chose mostly compared to the correct answer. So let's do it. I'll also post this on Classroom so that you can see it more clearly. So first of all, I'll just go through the correct answers. Actually, I won't. I'm just going to go through the most missed, and I'll post this on Classroom, and you can check the correct answers. So number 1 relates to this image right here. We see this representation of Colombia. Colombia is the female representation of the United States in political cartoons. Uncle Sam is the traditional United States male version, but Colombia is the female version. She's the one we see sometimes like fighting or sowing the seeds of United States liberty and stuff like that. Here, Colombia's Easter bonnet, she's putting on this hat that looks like a warship, and that ship says world power on the side. I think it says Army and Navy here. Not that you would have been able to see that unless you really zoomed in on the exam, but then the little plume of her hat, or the smoke from the ship, says expansion. All right, she looks very dignified, and it's supposed to symbolize American world power, right? Is her Easter bonnet. So the first question says the ideas addressed in the image most directly relate to. A lot of people picked A and C. This is question number 1, so you can see that here. One person picked B. The correct answer was D, debates about United States acquisition of overseas territories. I think that's the most general and applicable answer here. A lot of people picked opposition to United States collective security arrangements with Western Europe. I don't see any reference to our security arrangement with Europe. I don't see any reference to Europe here. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't. So I'm not sure what drew you to that answer specifically. And then C was the increased visibility of women's organizations that criticized imperialism. Now, there was an anti-imperialist league, and I would say that that was not irrelevant during this time, but it's a little irrelevant to this image. Colombia, it's not about women's organizations. Colombia is the representation of the United States completely. So she doesn't represent women necessarily. She represents the United States in this image. So I think that this is just kind of acknowledging the debate of America being the like moral being is wearing this Easter bonnet of world power. Excuse me. So that's why D is the most correct. That there were debates about United States acquisition. It wasn't even that Puck was against United States acquisition. Puck was pretty pro imperialism at the time, but it's at least acknowledging sort of the image there. Okay. 2. Which of the following most directly led to the circumstances illustrated in this image? Now, you either picked A or C. I thought this was an interesting dynamic. I mean, 56%, most of you got it right, but I thought it was interesting that you either picked A or C. And so C said the United States contributions to Allied victory in the First World War. I think you guys are forgetting maybe that this period starts with the Spanish American War and that first bout of imperialism, that first major advance where we go beyond the borders of the United States and into other countries. So, yeah, I know we had just talked about the world wars, but this is more applicable to our initial imperialism. So that's why A is correct over C. All right, moving on. So we've got this quote here from Darlene Clark Hine, a historian on the Black Chicago Renaissance in 2012. So we have a secondary source here. It says, beginning in the 1930s and lasting into the 1950s, Black Chicago experienced a cultural renaissance. Chicago had become a major destination for Black Southern migrants. It was also an urban industrial center. This fact gave a unique working class and internationalist perspective to the cultural work that would take place there. Pardon me. A desire to live freely in the metropolis continued to characterize the aspirations of migrants and second wave Chicago migrants arrived. As second wave Chicago migrants arrived, the 1930s and 1940s witnessed a resurgence of Black working class political radicalism and was captured and reflected in the expressive visual literacy productions of Chicago Black Renaissance artists. I find this question to be a little strange myself. The political radicalism referred to in this excerpt was most directly a response to the experience of. I don't disagree that most people picked desegregation. I think with that word radicalism, there's a connection there to be made of advancement of social status in America. However, considering the year, the 1930s and 1940s, desegregation is not an option. Desegregation didn't really officially take place until, I would say, in America, the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education, which isn't until 1954. So sadly, we're not quite there yet in history. The political radicalism is more a reaction of the economic shift for Black America after the economic depression, the Great Depression. So the working class political radicalism is more referring to an uprising of Black persons in the working world in America. So that's why B is the correct answer. Sadly, we're not quite to desegregation yet. So then we have question 8 related to Roosevelt's speech on the 4 freedoms. So this was before we entered World War II, and he was sort of defending his economic support for Great Britain. So in future days, we seek to make secure. We look forward to the world founded upon 4 essential freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And the question that was most missed for you guys was which of the following most directly contributed to Roosevelt's view that freedom from want was necessary? So, freedom from want is a weird one to explain, but it's basically like an economic freedom of some kind that you want to feel secure and have a reasonable standard of living during this time. And we had just come out of that, or we're working towards coming out of that. That we um, as a country are trying to bring ourselves have been trying to bring ourselves out of this Great Depression. And I think he's recognizing that in world terms. So, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. So it's this experience of economic freedom and being in a stable living condition that he is trying to fight for, or at least secure worldwide. And that has a lot to do with the domestic and global economic upheavals during the 1930s, namely the Great Depression. I'd say D, which was the most chosen answer, the fear of Soviet threat to spread communism to nations in the West, would more directly relate to the freedom from fear, not from the freedom from want. That we don't want to want anymore, right? Like we did in the 1930s and the Great Depression. We want to feel secure in our economy. Um, we do also want this, the freedom from fear of Soviet threat, but it's not really what the question is asking with relation to the freedom from want. So that's why B is the correct answer there. Okay, where are we going to next? So we've got Jane Addams here, Why Women Should Vote, from the Ladies' Home Journal in 1910. She says, to turn the administration of our civic affairs wholly over to men may mean that the American city will continue to push forward in its commercial and industrial development and continue to lag behind in those things which make it a beautiful which make a city healthful and beautiful. If women have in any sense been responsible for the gentler side of life, which softens and blurs some of its harsher conditions, may they not have a duty to perform in our American cities? If women if woman would fulfill her traditional responsibility to her own children, if she would educate and protect from danger factory children who must find their recreation on the street, then she must bring herself to the use of the ballot, that latest implement for self government, the ballot being the right to vote. So 14 was the most missed. So Adams' ideas expressed in the excerpt have most in common with which of the following historical views about women? Now, most, which I admire, is the rejection, the most chosen, which I do admire, was the rejection of traditional gender roles by feminists in the mid 20th century. So the 1960s is probably what this is referring to. I don't think that this is totally turning away from traditional gender roles, unfortunately, right? She is making a statement about why women should influence the vote and influence the society. But she's basically saying, if women have in any sense been responsible for the gentler side of life, which softens and blurs some of its harsher conditions, may they not have a duty to perform in our cities? She's basically saying that we need a gentler side casting the vote in our society. We need to calm these harsh conditions with women's duty, that she should fulfill her traditional responsibility of protecting children and so on and so forth, and educate them and protect them. So I don't think that they're necessarily turning away from traditional gender roles. I think she's saying that we need to embrace that traditional gender role and allow it to vote in society. So that's why B is more correct, is the belief that some mid-19th century reformers that women could act as the moral voice in society. So it's that morality of women that we saw in the original right to vote, suffragette movement in the mid 1800s. And that's why B is more correct. Let's see. So then we have Calvin Coolidge in his inaugural address in 1925. Okay, so Coolidge was right before Hoover, and then which was before Roosevelt, right? So Coolidge and Hoover had some pretty, opposing points of view compared to Roosevelt in how the government should address taxation and economic reform. So Coolidge says we ought to have tax reform. The method of raising revenue ought not to impede the transaction of business. It ought to encourage it. So it's got to encourage business, not impede it, not get in the way of it. I am opposed to extremely high rates because they produce little or no revenue, because they are bad for the country, and finally, because they are wrong. We cannot finance the country. We cannot improve social conditions through any system of injustice, even if we attempt to inflict it upon the rich. So basically, he doesn't believe in fixing the country by taxing the rich. Those who suffer the most harm will be the poor. The wise and correct course to follow in taxation and all the other economic legislation is not to destroy those who have already secured success, but to create conditions under which everyone will have a better chance to be successful. So the question was, the ideas expressed in the excerpt by Coolidge were most similar to the ideas of which of the following? The correct answer, even though we haven't covered it, sadly, and I don't know that we will get to it before the actual exam because it seems like they've cut out period 8 and 9. But the correct answer was New Conservatives. Oh wow, I just realized this should be there. Great Society supporters in the 1960s. I wonder if that had anything to do with it. But it should be New Conservatives in the 1980s is the correct answer. A lot of people picked New Dealers in the 1930s. Coolidge would not have supported New Dealers in the 1930s. He would not have supported the complete overhaul of the federal government, the expansion of the federal government, and new programs and new taxation in the 1930s. He would have had a more laissez-faire and conservative view such as that in the 1980s. Also, I'm not sure why this was wrong because I gave these questions to you earlier, but I won't harp on that point. But yeah, Coolidge is more aligned with New Conservatives in the 1980s. All right. Then I think we have this graph, which I also gave you before this exam, the population of Chicago between 1890 and 1990. So the question that there's two questions that were most missed were 21 and 23. So 21, which of the following groups was least likely to have contributed to the trend of Chicago's population from 1890 to 1940? A lot of you chose Eastern and Southern Europe. If anything, this is the group that was coming into the United States the most. I can't speak to Chicago specifically, but again, this group is coming into the United States the most during this time. So I wouldn't rule that one out. We're trying to find the least likely to have contributed to the trend of Chicago's population. And it's clear from 1890 to 1940, we're seeing an increase in the population, right? Okay. So the one group that was completely cut off from entering the United States during this time was Eastern and Southern Asia with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this is the group that is least likely to have contributed to any huge trend in the United States. Especially in this time period, 1890 to 1940, the Chinese Exclusion Act didn't end until 1943. So again, we're not seeing a huge contribution from Eastern and Southern Asia at this time. Okay. The other one, the one effect of the population changes that occurred nationwide from 1950 to 1990 was and I'm not sure that, I mean, this is clearly not evident in the graph. It's one of those speculative questions that they want you to ask, those like continuity and change over time questions. So the correct answer is increased economic influence of the South and the West. So after World War II, from 1950 to 1990, the South and the West were growing as an economic influence in the United States. And in my last presentation, I kind of talked about that with the growth of suburban America and the increased economy. We had more urban sprawl, more purchasing of automobiles during this time, especially in the 1950s. And with Eisenhower, we now are starting to build the highway system. So there's more connection between states than ever before. But particularly after World War II, the South became more industrialized in war manufacturing and airline manufacturing. So they were coming up finally after like those reconstructive years in that time. And then with the West, you have like more Hollywood, etc., and more connection via the highway system. So that's why D is correct. But A was the most chosen. Decreased economic influence of immigrants on the United States society. I would say that immigrants have never, I think as a whole, have in American history have an increased economic influence. They're typically low wage labor in the United States. I wouldn't choose an answer that would immediately be on the side of immigrants decreasing economic influence. So that's my reasoning for that. If that's not a good enough reason, I'm more than happy to go over it more. Just let me know. Let's see, are there any other ones here? Yes. So we've got this image. The girl he left behind is still behind him. She's a WOW, woman ordnance worker. So you can kind of see while she's working, she's kind of thinking of him, who's off at war. So which of the following represents a later example of the change highlighted in the poster? So the correct answer was feminist calls for equal economic opportunities in the 1970s. I've tried to make this point in class before, that women went to work during World War II in the 40s and were empowered and felt like they were contributing to a greater goal in society and something powerful. And then when men came home from war, were expected to be the homemaker and the mother. And even though many women were still working during this time in the 50s and 60s, I think 1 out of 3 or a third of women were working during this time, still women were sort of expected to be a homemaker. And so in the 50s and 60s, mostly the 50s, that kind of inspired women's liberation in the 60s and 70s, that like, hey, we also can be empowered to do this. But you guys were a little all over the place on this answer. Some people picked B, C, and D. C and D were in greater numbers. So which of the following represents a later example of the change highlighted in the poster? Some of you said the increasing inability of the manufacturing sector to create jobs for women in the 70s and 80s. There's no inability there. I'm sure there was some like gender discrimination there, but there's no inability there. And D, the growing popular consensus about appropriate women's roles in the 80s and 90s. I'm not sure, like the growing popular consensus about appropriate women's roles. What are appropriate women's roles in the 80s and 90s? Just going to work, is that appropriate? I think more generally speaking, feminist calls for equal economic opportunities in the 70s is the way to go, because women really did fight for liberation, for equal pay and equal work, equal opportunity in the 70s. And I know we haven't gotten there yet in that history, but that is what happened in the 70s. Okay, I think that's it. If you want, I will post this in Google Classroom, but if you want to go over the short answer, the short answer responses and the LEQ responses, they are here in this. I screenshotted and put into this document the correct answers. So it's there for you. I suggest you review it. This unit exam. So this unit will be on the overall exam. They did not take away period 7. Period 7 is still there for you. So please do indulge in that, in reviewing that, because this is still important to the exam. I imagine, because this is already a high percent on the original exam, even with this modified version, because we're at home now. This will probably be a big portion of the exam, at least. I mean, I don't know how many questions it's going to be yet, but at least a few. So please study, review. I will post the metacognition today. I love you guys. Be safe, be healthy, and just do it. Just do it. All right. Be well.